Imagine waking up tomorrow and your gas costs 3 times what it did yesterday. Your grocery prices have doubled. The stock market has collapsed overnight. And somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a body of water most people couldn't find on a map, a single decision made by one government has just sent shockwaves through every economy on Earth. This isn't a movie. This isn't a hypothetical. Everything I'm about to tell you has either already happened or is one miscalculation away from happening right now. This is what happens when Iran decides to go to war. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong about Iran. They think of it as a poor, isolated country, cornered, weak, held back by decades of sanctions and international pressure. That is exactly what Iran wants you to think. Here's the reality. Iran sits at one of the most strategically critical locations on Earth, bordered by Iraq, Turkey, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Caspian Sea, and the Persian Gulf simultaneously. U.S. geostrategist Zbigniew Brzezinski called Iran a geopolitical pivot on the Grand Eurasian chessboard, capable of influencing power dynamics between Europe, Russia, and East Asia. Iran doesn't need to be the strongest country in the room. It just needs to sit in the right seat. And for the last 4 decades, it has built the most sophisticated indirect warfare system the modern world has ever seen. Forget conventional armies. Forget aircraft carriers and fighter jets. Iran's weapon is something else entirely. Here's how Iran actually fights. It doesn't. Not directly. Iran's Quds Force, the elite external operations branch of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, serves as the main point of contact with a network of allied fighting groups throughout the Middle East, providing them with training, weaponry, and funds to advance Iranian regional objectives. This network has a name, the Axis of Resistance, and it operates like a spider's web stretched across the entire Middle East. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, a heavily armed organization that Iran spends an estimated $700 million to $1 billion every year supporting, covering salaries, weapons, and infrastructure. In Yemen, the Houthis, a fighting force that has demonstrated the ability to launch drone strikes at Saudi oil facilities, attack commercial shipping in the Red Sea, and fire ballistic missiles from 2,000 kilometers away. In Iraq, dozens of militia groups, some with seats in parliament, some with weapons pointed at American military bases. And in Gaza, Palestinian resistance groups fighting one of the longest ongoing occupations in modern history. The point of this network isn't just to cause chaos. It gives Iran the ability to project power, deter adversaries, and resist foreign military dominance, while limiting direct confrontation. In other words, Iran can apply pressure without technically going to war, and that strategy has held for 40 years, until 2025. Now we get to the thing that keeps every intelligence agency on Earth awake at night: Iran's nuclear program. In May 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency reported that Iran's cache of near-weapons-grade enriched uranium had surged by approximately 50% over the prior 3 months, putting Iran just a step away from having enough enriched uranium for 10 nuclear weapons. 10. And the timeline to actually building one. The Defense Intelligence Agency assessed that Iran would have needed probably less than 1 week to produce that amount of fissile material. 1 week. That is not a distant threat. That is not a future problem. That is a match sitting 1 inch from a fuse. On June 13, 2025, Israel launched a series of military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities and senior military commanders. The IAEA Secretary General immediately condemned the attacks, stating that nuclear facilities must never be attacked, regardless of the context or circumstances. Multiple European governments called the strikes a violation of international law. Iran responded with ballistic missile strikes. Then, overnight, on June 21st to 22nd, the United States launched its own military strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, hitting a sovereign nation that was, at that exact moment, engaged in active diplomatic negotiations with Washington. The world held its breath. And what followed? told us everything about what a real war would look like. There is a narrow strip of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. At its narrowest point, it is 33 kilometers wide. That's roughly the distance from one side of a major city to the other. And through that 33-kilometer gap flows nearly 15 million barrels of crude oil every single day, nearly 34% of all global crude oil trade. This is the Strait of Hormuz, and it is Iran's most powerful card, even without a nuclear weapon. In February 2026, when US and Israeli strikes intensified, Iran moved to effectively close the strait. The International Energy Agency described what followed as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The largest in history. Not since World War II has a single geographic choke point caused this level of global economic disruption. The closure affected not just oil, but a cascade of other commodities, from aluminum to fertilizer to industrial chemicals, with wealthier nations outbidding poorer ones for what remained, while the most vulnerable populations simply went without. Fertilizer prices surged. Corn and soybean planting windows in the American Midwest were at risk. Urea prices jumped from $475 per metric ton to $680 per metric ton within weeks. And that's just food. Meanwhile, with oil prices surging toward $120 a barrel, Russia, whose war budget depends on oil revenue, received what analysts calculated as an additional $45 to $97 billion in budget revenues. Russia didn't fire a single shot, and it was winning. This is where the World War III scenario stops being hypothetical, because Iran doesn't stand alone. There is strong evidence that Russia has been providing Iran with satellite imagery and other intelligence on the locations of American warships and aircraft in the region. Iran's foreign minister did not deny this, stating in a televised interview that military cooperation with Russia and China still continues. Let that sink in. Russia, which is already fighting a war in Ukraine against a NATO-armed opponent, is feeding targeting intelligence to a country actively exchanging fire with the United States military. If the conflict deepens and China shifts from passive economic support to material assistance and intelligence sharing, the consequences become systemic. With the Russia-China-Iran alliance cohering into a coalition with genuine global weight, we would no longer be talking about a regional conflict. We would be talking about a world reorganized into two opposing blocs, the United States and its allies on one side, Russia, China, and Iran on the other. And here's the part that nobody talks about: Europe's deep reservations about the conflict, which several European states flatly declared to be illegal, will leave an enduring scar in the transatlantic alliance, giving some leaders a pretext to reject US moral leadership now and in the future. The alliance system that won World War II, the Cold War, and defined the 20th century is fracturing in real time, right now. So here is the real question. Not whether Iran can start a world war. We've just established it can, not through military superiority, but through geography, timing, alliances, and economic leverage that no amount of airstrikes can fully destroy. The real question is, what does it want? Iran's leadership has always had one consistent goal: survival of the regime and resistance against foreign military dominance over its region. Every alliance, every missile, every centrifuge spinning underground is in service of that single objective. The strikes cannot destroy Iran's nuclear knowledge it has accumulated over decades. Iran still possesses a nuclear weapons capability. It has, according to the US government's own assessment, since 2007. You can bomb facilities. You cannot bomb knowledge. And if the ongoing war fails to change the Iranian government, it will likely adopt an even stronger position, rebuild its military, and forge deeper partnerships with Moscow and Beijing. In other words, a military campaign that doesn't finish the job doesn't end the problem. It amplifies it. Here's where we actually are. In the last 12 months, the world has witnessed the largest oil supply disruption in history. Strikes on Iranian soil that multiple governments called illegal under international law. Iranian ballistic missiles fired at a US military base. the activation of the most complex regional resistance network ever assembled, and the quiet, steady hardening of a Russia-China-Iran alignment that some of the world's most respected geopolitical thinkers spent decades warning would be catastrophic if it ever materialized. We are not watching the beginning of a potential World War III. We are watching a version of it already playing out, in slow motion, in fragments, in proxy battles and supply chain disruptions and oil tankers that no longer move through a 33-kilometer strip of water. The question was never whether Iran could trigger something that reshapes the world. It already has. The question is whether the world can stop it from going further. And the honest answer, from the people who actually study this for a living, is that nobody knows. If this kept you watching, subscribe, because this story is nowhere near over.